Welcome to Education Forum. I'm Herman Badillo, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the City University. The improvement of education affects all New Yorkers. This program will focus on the key educational issues and challenges before us all. My guest today is Anthony Coles, who is the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Education, and Cultural Affairs. Deputy Mayor Coles graduated from Tufts University, summa cum laude, and from Columbia Law School. And after practicing law for some time, he joined Mayor Rudolph Giuliani in 1994 and has been working with the mayor and with me at first as deputy counsel, then as senior advisor to the mayor, and now as deputy mayor. First of all, Tony, I want to thank you for your support at the City University and ask you, why is it that dealing with the problems of education has been so difficult for City Hall?
We're making real progress, but it is slow. And the changes that have happened in the police department have happened in welfare reform, in job creation, all of which have been terrific, have happened faster. The real reason for that is one of accountability. Many people don't understand this, but these schools are not run by the mayor. They're run by a Board of Education. The Board of Education is appointed by the borough presidents. They have between them 5 appointees, and the mayor just has 2. So the mayor just has 2 of 7 appointments. So ultimately, you have a system that is insulated from accountability. The problem with that is that a mayor who's a reform mayor who wants to change education isn't able to make sure that the system is running as efficiently as it should.
Now that the mayor is coming to the end of his 2 terms and cannot run again, do you think that his proposals in education will have a better chance in going through, since they will apply to the future mayor, not to him?
I think possibly. I mean, one major proposal he has is to do what's happening in other cities around the country, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Boston, which is create mayoral accountability for the schools. That way, if people don't like the way the schools are being operated, they can get a new mayor. They actually can have some say in the process. Right now, there's a real gap between the schools and mayoral accountability. If parents don't like the way the schools are being run, they really don't have anyone to complain to, because the mayor doesn't run the school system. Chicago has changed that. Boston, Detroit has changed that. And the fact that the mayor is proposing this to begin in 2002, after the end of his term, takes politics out of it. This is about education, not politics. So I'm hopeful.
What about the likelihood of getting more money for education based upon the Supreme Court decision recently that says that the Constitution of the State of New York requires that there be a different formula so that the children can get a sound basic education?
Right. Money is important, but you also have to spend the money well. So getting additional money would be very valuable to the public schools, but also we have to make sure that money is spent properly. And in order to make sure it's spent properly, you need real radical reform of the education system. You need to do what's happening in other cities around the country. And so as the mayor talks about the need for additional money as a result of the lawsuit, he's also going to talk about making changes that will ensure parents that their kids are going to get a better education.
Such as?
Well, I think that the first is to set up a system like in Chicago where accountability for the schools is with the mayor, not with an indirect, unaccountable agency. That way you can make sure that the money you get actually goes to the classroom. I mean, it's very unfortunate now, but in some cases, 52 cents of every dollar doesn't go to the classroom. It gets lost in the bureaucracy. First, it gets lost in the bureaucracy at the Board of Education, then it gets lost in the bureaucracy at the community school boards, and then finally what's left over after those 2 bureaucracies goes into the classroom. So you have to get the money into the classroom, otherwise the money isn't really going to work well. But there are other changes you have to put in place too. Additional charter schools. Charter schools are a great opportunity for parents who want alternatives to the public school system. They're public schools, but they're public schools that are independent of the Board of Education. And the demand for those is tremendous.
Well, it seems that in the issue of choice, that is, the idea that parents should have a choice, as the mayor says, they should have the same choice, parents of poor children, as the parents of wealthier children. They should have a choice about which schools to go. The issue of vouchers seems to be much more difficult, doesn't it? Although You recently testified before the City Council.
I did. I testified before the City Council because the mayor has proposed a pilot school choice voucher program in New York City.
And that was totally opposed by Chancellor Crew.
It was opposed by Chancellor Crew. Chancellor Levy hasn't taken a position on it. The mayor is proposing it again now. And essentially what we would do is give poor parents in one school district the same choice that wealthier parents have to send their children to a school where they believe their children will get the best education possible. It would be available only for low-income parents, modeled after the Milwaukee program.
Now that needs the approval of the City Council, right?
It needs the approval of the City Council, but we would really make this a win-win situation, because if a district was chosen as a school choice district, we would also give that district $12 million additional dollars, separate and apart from the voucher proposal, to use for district purposes. So you have a great situation. You have a district getting additional money to use for educational initiatives within the district, and then you also have parents who are demanding more choice and more alternatives, having an opportunity to send their children to another school.
Does the Board of Education have to approve it, assuming that the City Council approves it?
Well, if the City Council approves it, then we can put it in place. We also could do it with the Board of Education, but right now I don't think the votes are there at the Board of Education.
What about the argument that it's unconstitutional according to the state constitution, which many people say is even more rigid than the federal one because of the so-called Blaine Amendment, which prohibits aid to parochial schools?
Right. I don't think it's unconstitutional, and here's why. There are really three different reasons. The first reason is the money is going to the parents. It's not going to a parochial school. It's going to a parent, and then the parent decides to spend the money at a parochial school, at a private school, or maybe even to redeem it at the public school. So the decision is being made by the parent, not by the government. Secondly, we already have a program in place that's essentially a voucher program, and it's very, very effective. The TAP program and the Pell Grant program.
Tuition assistance plan.
The tuition assistance plan and the Pell Grant plan basically are plans that give students who want to go to college a grant to go to college. And they can use that at Notre Dame, they can use that at Fordham, and both of those on the Pell Grant situation, or they can use it in any school in the state under the tuition assistance plan. Then also with daycare, is we actually provide daycare vouchers, and parents who want to send their children to daycare can use the voucher and send them, if they want to, daycare at a church.
Do you think you'd have a better chance of getting it approved if you called it a tuition assistance plan, a TAP plan for the elementary and secondary schools?
Now, I think there's a value in calling it a voucher, because that's ultimately what it is. Maybe a choice voucher is a good term, but I think sometimes if you can come up with euphemisms, but the basic concept really is a concept that it's a moral concept, isn't it? That education is so important to parents and to children that it's unfair to tell low-income parents that their children have to go to a school that may be a failing school and maybe has been on a list of failing schools for 4 or 5 or in some cases 10 years. Parents should have a choice to move their children out of that school.
Well, why, if I agree with you about the importance of education, but why did a career educator like Rudy Crew, who had a very good relationship with the mayor, completely destroy that relationship over primarily that one issue, vouchers?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to what motivated Chancellor Crew. He did many good things for the school system. He did disagree with us on school choice. And look, our view is that school choice can make a difference in the lives of children. It can make a difference in the lives of children today. Imagine yourself as a parent whose only neighborhood school is a school that's been on the state's failing list for 5 or 6 or 7 years. And your child is mandated by the government to go to that school, and you don't have the resources to move that child to another school. I mean, that is a terrible situation. And if we can cure that, if we actually can give you the choice to send your child to another school, that's a great thing to do. And based on Milwaukee, here's what else will happen. The public schools will get better. The genius of America is competition. Unfortunately, right now, the public school system is completely insulated from competition. What you're seeing in Milwaukee and Florida is that competition is making the public schools improve, because all of a sudden they're competing for the kids. They don't want the kids to go to the private school or the parochial school, so they're working harder to make sure they do a better job.
Well, it's clear that there's strong support for such a proposal based upon the fact that recently a group of people made available 2,500 scholarships to parents, and 168,000 parents applied. So that seems to show overwhelming support on the part of the parents of school children for the equivalent of vouchers. But why is it then based on that so many political leaders oppose the program?
Yeah, this is really a situation where the parents are ahead of the elected officials. The parents see the benefit of vouchers because they're talking about their children and they're talking about the future of their children. Unfortunately, it's taking a longer time for a consensus to develop among the political leaders.
And why is that?
Honestly, I think part of
the union?
I think part of the reason of that is that there is a very entrenched educational status quo that is trying to block new ideas. The union is absolutely part of that. The union, at every opportunity, tries to suffocate this idea. There's a certain fear of new ideas, which really doesn't make sense, does it, in the area of education? Education ought to be where you encourage new ideas, where you try to experiment with new ideas, not where you try to suffocate them at birth. That's essentially what the entrenched interests and what the union are trying to do with vouchers. And it's a shame because it's working in Milwaukee. And if it can work in Milwaukee and give hope to thousands of parents and to their children, it can happen here too. And we ought to try it. We shouldn't be scared of a new idea.
Well, the mayor was very successful in his negotiations with the principals union over a period of time in getting them to agree to eliminate tenure. Is there a chance that now that he's negotiating with the teachers union, he might be able to get some concessions to enable this to come about?
I don't know if we'll be able to get concessions on vouchers. The hope is we'll get other concessions that will be very important to reforming the public school system. Because look, most of our kids are going to be educated in the public school system, and that's how it should be. Vouchers are an opportunity, and they'll also be something that ought to be part of a program to improve the public schools, which is what's happening in other states and other cities around the country. That they give choice to parents who need them, but they also cause the public schools to improve themselves through competition. But another thing that we're trying to get through the union negotiations is better distinctions between teachers. Right now, the best teachers who work hard are treated the same and paid the same as teachers who are failing their kids and are not working hard.
You mean merit pay?
Yeah,
does that exist anywhere, merit pay?
There are various programs that are being proposed in different cities. I think Denver is trying it. I think it's been proposed in some areas in California, and in Tennessee, a professor came up with a very interesting program as to how you would actually put merit pay in place. So this is an idea that is percolating all around the country. But here's the conception behind it. It's wrong to say that a very bad teacher who's not committed to our kids is just as important to the system as the best teacher who really is committed to the kids and works around the clock for the kids. If you can't make distinctions between two different types of teachers like that, then you're not really focusing on the importance of education. Then the system is about protecting jobs, not about student performance. Teachers ought to be paid, they ought to be rewarded, and they ought to be evaluated based on the improvement of their students, not on just a sort of a sense that their job ought to be protected no matter what.
We'll be back after these announcements.
What if you had to choose between a flower and an elephant? What would you choose? What if you had to decide between a 100-year-old tree and a 1,000,000-year-old beach? Could you choose between drinking clean water or breathing clean air? Now you can choose all these things. EarthShare, the world's leading environmental groups working together. It's one choice we can all live with.
What are you gonna take?
Algebra.
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 Algebra!
If no one's explained how algebra, geometry, and calculus can improve your future, call NACME. We'll tell you.
We're back today with Anthony Coles, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Education, and Cultural Affairs. Now, we've talked about choice, and we still have a lot of difficulties with vouchers. But one thing we do have approval for is charter schools. State legislature has approved them, and we've begun to move in New York City. First, tell us, as you said before, charter schools are public schools, but how are charter schools provided? How do they come about?
Well, first of all, I think both you, Mr. Badillo, and the governor also deserve a lot of credit for bringing about the charter school law, which has been a terrific innovation in New York State. Basically, what a charter school is, it's an independent school that's organized by a board of directors separate and apart from the Board of Education. So local community groups and people interested in education can set up their own school. They set it up according to standards of performance, so the school has to meet state standards. It has to continue doing well to stay in existence. But here's the important part. If parents decide to send their children to those schools, the public school money follows the child to the charter school. So charter schools are essentially public schools. They have to accept all applicants. They're funded by public money, and they're bound by the general non-discrimination rules that apply to the Board of Education.
Now, how many charter schools have been approved in New York City up to now?
Well, now it's only about 16 charter schools.
Okay. Now, which groups have secured approval for those schools, so people get an idea of how they come about?
Well, it's different types of organizations. It's not-for-profit schools.
Yeah.
It's for-profit schools like Edison, Victory schools. Very often what you'll see is organizations grouping together, maybe a church organization or an organization related with a church and people interested in forming schools.
But
it wouldn't be a religious
school.
school. It wouldn't be a religious school, but it would be a school that essentially grows out of the community. It's an effort really to, all our schools ought to be charter schools. I mean, charter schools are basically schools that are run by principals and by board of directors, directly accountable for their actions.
But they're not accountable to the Board of Education.
Right.
Who are they accountable to?
They're accountable to the state. And actually, it's a very good system. The state in the charter...
The State Board of Regents.
The State Board of Regents has performance criteria. And the schools have to meet the performance criteria to continue as charter schools. And if they don't, then they'll lose their charter. Now, that's a level of accountability that you only see with charter schools. And I have to tell you, as a parent, you probably want to see that level of accountability. Right now, if a public school is failing, and some have been on the failing list for up to 10 years, well, they continue on the failing list. And in many cases, there's no hope of turning them around because they're not accountable for their performance. All of a sudden, with charter schools, we have schools that are much closer to the community, that are much more efficient, and maybe most important, they're also accountable. And of course, they're public schools as well.
So a group of parents who is affiliated with, let's say, a church in the Bronx would be able to form a board and apply for a charter school?
They would. And they may actually also want to bring into their group an organization that has some experience in setting up schools. That would give them technical assistance, and there are a number of different organizations that do that. Now it can't be a religious school, but obviously you can have people from a local church or from a local community group. And then they would organize their school, and they would make an application to the state. And the application that would either go to the Board of Regents or to the State University of New York would lay out their plan for the school. It's then reviewed carefully by the state. If the state has questions, there are follow-up discussions, and then the plan is approved or not. If it's approved, you can be sure it's a pretty good plan.
And do they have to have union teachers?
They don't have to have union teachers if in their first year the enrollment at the school is less than 250 students. And then if the school is bigger than that in its first year, it's up to the teachers. The union contract would apply, but I believe in certain instances the teachers can vote not to be guided by the union rules.
Now, one of the complaints that I've heard from people who want to start charter schools, they say the law does not give them any money for capital grants, that is for building a school or for renting facilities. And the mayor and you recently announced a new $10 million program to help in that area. Tell us about it.
Right. Well, if you think about it, one of the biggest costs in setting up a school is buying a school building or leasing a premises where you can put a school. And the fact that state law doesn't provide money to do that to charter schools, but of course it does to public schools, is really an Achilles heel in the development of charter schools. So the mayor recognized that, and he tried to solve it by setting up a charter school improvement fund. The fund would provide up to $250,000 to charter schools, but really for capital items, leasing a school, building out a school, putting in a computer lab or library. The purpose of that is to make up for the fact that the state law doesn't provide for capital funds.
Now, the mayor got approval for that? He doesn't need approval from the city council, or did he do it out of his own funds?
No, that was approved. That was done with the approval of the city council. Okay. It was proposed by the mayor.
So the money is available now?
The money is available, and Speaker Vallone should be congratulated for being part of that. And there's one other piece to that that's really important, is we want to make sure that the charter schools that get the money are charter schools that are going to succeed and are doing a good job for their students. So if a grant is given, say a grant of up to $250,000, we'll hold back 10% of that grant. And then after a year, we'll take a look at the school. And if the school is doing better than most of the schools in its district, we'll give them that 10% plus a 10% bonus. If they're doing in the middle, they'll get just the 10% back. But if they're in the bottom part of the district, we'll withhold the 10% and try to reallocate that to a school that's in the top 10%. So the thought is by creating an incentive that's attached to the money, we may be able to spur even better educational performance at the schools.
Now, one of the things that you said before is that if a school is failing, nobody can do anything about it. And that's why you need charter schools. And I agree, because recently I read in the newspapers a few months ago, the 8th grade tests were announced. And in school after school in the South Bronx, the level of students performing at grade level was like 0, 0, 0. So it wasn't just failing students, but failing schools. Why doesn't the Board of Education do anything about it?
Well, they're beginning. Really at the suggestion of the mayor, the board recently has taken 5 of its worst schools on the state's failing list, and has offered to contract with the Edison schools, which is a for-profit school company.
So in effect, they're making them charter schools.
Right? They're going to make them charter schools. Now the mayor wanted to see maybe 20 schools in the first year. The board decided to do 5, but we're going to push for more
well, there are
next year and this year.
Almost 90 schools that have been officially designated as failing,
Right.
and maybe another 90 more that could be designated
That's
in that
right.
way.
So 5 is an important step, but it's a small step, and that ought to be significantly expanded. Look, here's the theory behind it. If a school has been on the failing list for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, what hope is it that it's going to be turned around? Let's give somebody else a chance to turn it around. If you think it's going to be turned around and it hasn't been turned around for 4 or 5 years, the truth is you're fooling yourself, and even worse, you're fooling parents and you're fooling their children. Give somebody else an opportunity to turn the school around under those circumstances.
And you think that the board in the future might agree to release more of those schools?
I'm hopeful. You never know. The mayor is going to continue to push for it. And if the first 5 schools begin to do better, then I think you'll have a very good predicate for forcing the board to expand it to more schools. But ultimately, there's nothing to lose in taking a school that's failing and saying, look, we weren't able to make this school a success. Let's have somebody else try and do it. You probably ought to do that for virtually every school that's failing. Because the truth is, why is a school failing? Because you've allowed it to deteriorate to the point where it's been placed on the state's list of failing schools. And then it deteriorates to that point, and then you allow it to be on that list for 4 or 5 or 6 years. Well, somebody else ought to have an opportunity at that point.
Why can't we get more publicity about the reality that there's such a huge percentage of schools that are failing? You know, it's not a personal problem of the mayor, certainly, and just a fight between the mayor and the chancellor and the Board of Education. It's a vital issue to the children of this city, and yet we don't seem to be making headway in persuading the political people in the local districts that the change has to be made.
Yeah, people sometimes are scared of radical reform. But I think more and more people will tell you today what the school system needs more than anything else is radical reform. It needs more alternatives. Its basic structure needs to be changed. All the types of things the mayor's been talking about, that you've been talking about as well, and others. But in answer to one of your questions earlier, I said that parents are ahead of the elected officials in many cases. I mean, parents are there. Parents understand the problem, and it's elected officials now that are just beginning to catch up to parents. But I think over the next few years, you're going to see more school choice, you're going to see more charters, you're going to see more innovation. You're going to see the type of things that are important in America: competition, alternatives, and choice.
Well, at least the local political leaders are not opposing the charter schools. So if we can get more charter schools approved, that may lead to reducing the opposition. No?
Absolutely, and charter schools are a model for most schools.
Well, when we solve that, we may be able to also win the battle of vouchers too, because the difference between one and the other is really not that great. Why do you think that charter schools have approval and vouchers don't?
Well, it's really hard to figure that out. I guess charter schools are still public schools, so people don't see it moving as far in the direction as they would if you put in place a voucher program. But here's the point, is we should be primarily concerned with how well our children are being educated and less concerned with who is educating them. Right now, too much of the concern is who is going to be educating our kids, and not enough of the concern is how well are our kids being educated. And I think what you're seeing with the call for parents for vouchers and more choice, and from some elected officials now, is a recognition that we ought to be focused on the quality of the education, not who's doing the educating.
And the results. Right.
And the results.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here.
You can reach us by email at our website, www.cuny.tv, or write to us at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016.